Hi everyone, Sam here. Welcome to another episode of Azure Snippets. Today we're going to have a look at the Azure command line interface, or Azure CLI. And this is really intended if you're just getting started with the CLI, you've never used it before, maybe you haven't even heard of the Azure CLI. So we'll do today as a brief introduction to what it is, why you might want to use it, and how it works. So if you're fairly new to Azure and you've only ever interacted with it through the portal, then you might not be aware that there are a number of different ways outside of the portal to work with Azure. At the command line, using things like ARM templates, using external tools like Terraform and so on. And today we're going to have a look at the CLI. If you are familiar, then you might be aware that there are actually two ways to work with Azure at the command line. There is the PowerShell libraries, and then there is the Azure CLI. And it can get a bit confusing as to why there are two different things and which one you would want to use. And generally the answer to this is going to be whichever one you're comfortable with. So the PowerShell libraries are sort of the first instance of accessing Azure from the command line. They've been around for quite a long while. They've recently been updated to the AZ commandlets, which are able to work in PowerShell 6 and cross-platform, and they allow you to use PowerShell to interact with Azure. The alternative is the CLI, which it's been around for quite a while, but we're actually on Azure CLI 2. So the first instance was pretty basic and wasn't terribly well used. Azure CLI 2 has been around now for a couple of years, and whereas the PowerShell commandlets are sort of focused on the PowerShell type workflow and were obviously developed for use on Windows primarily, the CLI is much more focused around the non-Windows approach, so Linux and Mac and so on. And in fact, the CLI really comes into its own when you are using it in a Linux or Unix type terminal such as Bash and so on. That's really what it's designed for. So the choice between PowerShell and CLI is primarily going to come down to which one you prefer working with. Do you want a PowerShell type approach using the PowerShell noun-verb approach and feeding the responses back into PowerShell commands, retrieving objects and so on in that way in a more sort of .NET fashion? Or do you prefer a more Linux type terminal approach with Linux formatted commands and that has been designed for those sort of use? There are a few other reasons why you might choose to use one or the other. CLI is obviously cross-platform, so it can run on Windows, Linux, or Mac. You can now achieve that same sort of thing with the PowerShell commandlets using PowerShell 6 and so on. But then again, not everything has been ported over to PowerShell 6 yet. So some of the other commandlets, like the Azure AD commandlets, haven't actually been ported to the cross-platform mode yet. And then the other reason why you might want to use CLI is because there are features in there that don't exist in the PowerShell. And that isn't uncommon, particularly when we're looking at previews of certain things. It seems to be nowadays that actually a lot of the preview things get commands into CLI before we see them in PowerShell. And sometimes that even extends to GA. There are some commands that exist in the CLI that do not exist in PowerShell at the moment. So if you need to use commands that are only present in CLI, obviously that will force you down that route. And finally, just to say, it's not uncommon for people to have both PowerShell libraries and CLI installed on their machines. Okay, you want to try out the CLI? Let's see how you get it installed and how it all works. So as I mentioned, CLI can be used on Windows, Mac and Linux, and so there are multiple different ways to actually install it. On Windows, it's fairly straightforward. You can just download the MSI and install it. There's also a PowerShell command you can run that will actually install it as well. All that's doing is downloading the MSI and then running the silent install for you. So Windows is fairly straightforward. If you're using Mac, then the recommended approach to install that is to use Homebrew, and so do brew install of Azure CLI. And then on Linux, it gets a little bit more complicated because there are different commands for different distributions. I'm focusing on Ubuntu here because I'm actually running this in the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is on my PC running Ubuntu. So if we have a look at that, again, this is fairly straightforward. There is a single line command you can do to actually run the installer, and that will get everything set up. One thing to bear in mind when you run these commands, it will take a while to do the install. I'm talking sort of 10-15 minutes. It's a fairly long install process, so don't be surprised if it sits there for a little while. So I've got the CLI installed on here. The first thing we can do is actually check that it's installed and working. We can just run the AZ command. So any CLI commands are going to start with the word AZ. So if we just run AZ, that should show us some nice ASCII art and then give us some information about the commands that are available. And we can, if we want, check the version of the CLI. Okay, so now we know that's installed. let's clear the screen. Okay, the first thing we need to do if we're going to use the CLI is actually log in. So before we do that, if you try and do anything, you'll get an error saying you're not connected. So we need to log into Azure, same as you would do in the portal or in the PowerShell commands. So to log in, we're going to use the AZ login command. And because I'm running this on WSL, it's going to ask me to use the device login option because it can't open a browser window for me. If you're running this natively in Windows or Mac or something, it will probably open the browser for you. But we can't do that, so we'll go ahead and log in. And need the code. And that will then show we're logged in. So we can go ahead and close that window. And go back to our CLI. And it's listed all the subscriptions I've got access to. So we'll go ahead and clear that. Now, if you've got multiple subscriptions, you are going to want to go ahead and select the one you're interested in to make sure that you are using that. So the way we do that is we run the AZ account set command. And this is sort of usually the way most of the commands look. So you've got AZ account is the type of object we're trying to work on, so we want to look at accounts, and then set is the verb of what we want to do. So you'll have other things like get, list, update, and so on. And then what we have to do is pass in any parameters that affect this. So we're going to do subscription, and we're going to pass in the subscription name. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the subscription ID in there. And that will connect to that subscription for us. So now we're all ready to go, and we can start using it. So the first thing we can do is, so let's say I want to list all the VMs that I've got access to. So let's figure out what the command is for that. So we can run AZ, and that should show us a lot of the different commands. And we can take a look through here and see if what we're interested in is listed. The other option is that all of the commands are listed on the Microsoft website, so you can again go in here and look through all of the commands that you can run. And so the one we're interested in is virtual machines. So we're going to have a look at AZVM, and this will then show us the different things we can do in here. So we're looking at AZVM, and then there's a number of subsets that we're interested in. So you can look at things that come under the virtual machine category, like availability sets, boot diagnostics, and so on. What we want to get is actually a list of the virtual machines. So if we scroll down, what we should see is we've got AZVM list. That's fairly simple, AZVM list, and then we can pass it some parameters to denote you want to look at a specific resource group or subscription, and we can get some more details as well in here. So let's go ahead and run that. We're just going to list all the VMs, so we can do AZVM list. And that's getting us lots of information about the virtual machines. That's given us a list of all the virtual machines, but it's a big long list of JSON attributes and so on. It's not the most useful format, so we're going to see if we can change that. So there are ways to format the information that comes out of the CLI. So we're going to do the same command. We're going to use the out parameter to format that as a table. And so as you can see, that's given us tabular information about what VMs we've got available and some basic information about the resource group, the location, and so on. Now, let's say we wanted to look at one of those specific VMs. We can then run the AZVM show command and then pass in the name parameter. And we're just going to query this first one in the list here. So we'll copy and paste that. And yes, so my mistake, we also need to pass in the resource group. So if you're querying by name, you have to pass in the resource group, or you have to pass in the ID. So we're going to pass in the resource group. So we can type out -- resource group, but there's also a shortcut here. So -G is the shortcut used for resource group, and we know the resource group because it's listed here. So we'll paste that in. And this just gets us the JSON information, but only for that specific virtual machine. Now, obviously, a virtual machine does have a lot of information in here, and this is all in JSON format. So if you want to then start getting specific information or filtering and so on, then you've got access to all of the tools that are available to you in your command line of choice. So in here in Bash, I could use things like grep and so on to actually find specific things I was interested in and manipulate them and so on. One really useful tool in the CLI that I don't find many people actually are aware of is the interactive shell. This can be really helpful if you're just getting started with the CLI, or if you just want some help with writing your commands. The interactive shell offers us some really nice functionality around autocomplete and help files. So let's have a look how that works. So if you type AZ interactive, and this will load the interactive shell. And so what this gives us first off is autocomplete. So if we look at the commands we were running before, we can type AZ, and then we've got listed all the commands here. So we can look through them. We're actually going to look at VM again. So if we start typing VM, it gives us the ones that are available. So we know we want VM, and we're going to use show again. So again, we can pick that from the autocomplete. And then a really nice feature here is that it gives us firstly a list of all the parameters that are available and a description of each of the parameters. And then secondly, down the bottom, we actually get some information from the help file. So firstly, it shows us the actual what the command's for, so get the details of a VM. And then below that, we actually get some examples. So there are a couple of examples here, just getting information about a particular VM, and then getting details for all VMs in a resource group. So some quite useful information. So we're going to pass in again the name, and you can see here it's actually populated the list with machine names from my subscription, and this is really nice. I mean, this obviously will get a bit painful if you have lots and lots of VMs, so you might not want to use that, but for a simple subscription that's really quite helpful. And then we're going to want to put in the resource group, and again it's going to give us the list of resource groups. So this is the one we want. And so there we go, we've got the same information that we had before. Another really nice feature of the interactive shell is you can actually have it default into your specific category. But what I mean by that is if you're going to be doing a lot of work with virtual machines, instead of typing azvm whatever command you want, what you could actually do now is set it to use the VM command automatically. So if we type %% VM and hit enter, you can see from the prompt we're now actually in the AZVM category. So any command I run now will run against the VM SKU. So if we just use list, I didn't have to type the VM part, I could just go and do that. So that's quite useful if you actually need to be doing a lot of commands on a specific category. You don't want to have to keep typing that over and over again. AZVM, or possibly not the most difficult thing to type, but if we're actually, say, looking at availability sets, so let's do that. So we're interested in availability. Availability set is a fairly long thing to type every time, so now I can just query availability sets using that. And if I want to go back to the default, I can just type %%, and that will be unscoped. So the interactive prompt is a really quite a nice tool if you're getting the hang of the CLI. Even for those familiar with the CLI, it can speed up your work by giving you the autocomplete and so on. So that's a very basic introduction to the CLI. There's a lot more you can do with it. There's a lot of powerful stuff you can do, particularly when you combine it with bash commands and other things, which you don't have time to go into right now. But if you're interested, let me know and we can do some more advanced videos on using the CLI. But hopefully if you've never used it before, this has given you enough of an introduction to actually go and play with it and see how it works and maybe use it in your day-to-day workflow. So thanks for your time today. I hope that was useful, and I'll see you next time on another episode of Azure Snippets.